What if I told you that thousands of years ago, ancient prophets made precise predictions about a nation that wouldn't even exist for centuries? And what if I told you that many of these prophecies have come true with stunning accuracy? Today, we're exploring the most remarkable fulfilled biblical prophecies about Israel, starting with the more general predictions and working our way toward the most specific and mind-blowing ones. Prophecy number 1, the scattering of the Jewish people. Let's begin with this one, and the primary prophecy comes from Deuteronomy 28:64 to 65, where Moses, speaking around 1400 BC, delivered this warning to the Israelites. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. Among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. Notice the specificity of this prophecy. Moses didn't just predict exile, he predicted global scattering from one end of the earth to the other. He also predicted that this wouldn't be a comfortable resettlement, but rather a restless wandering characterized by anxiety and longing. This wasn't the typical fate of conquered peoples in ancient times, who were usually absorbed into their conquerors' cultures within a generation or two. The prophet Hosea, writing around 750 BCE, added another crucial detail in Hosea 9:17. My God will reject them because they have not obeyed him. They will be wanderers among the nations. Again, we see the prediction of wandering, not permanent settlement, but a restless diaspora that would span generations. Deuteronomy 4:27 provides even more detail. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. This predicted not just scattering, but that the Jewish people would become a small minority wherever they went, which is exactly what happened. Now let's look at the remarkable historical fulfillment. The first major exile came in 722 BCE, when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and deported the 10 tribes. But the real beginning of the global diaspora came in 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem, burned Solomon's temple, and carried away the cream of Jewish society to Babylon. But this was just the first wave. The prophet's words about scattering from one end of the earth to the other wouldn't be fully realized until the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The historian Josephus, who witnessed these events firsthand, recorded that over 1 million Jews were killed during the siege of Jerusalem, and countless thousands more were sold into slavery and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. But here's where the prophecy becomes truly extraordinary. The scattering didn't end with the Roman dispersion, it continued for centuries. Jewish communities began appearing in the most unlikely places. By the Middle Ages, you could find thriving Jewish communities from Spain in the west to India and China in the east, from the cold reaches of Eastern Europe to the deserts of North Africa and Ethiopia. Think about the mathematical impossibility of this. Starting from a tiny nation in the Middle East, Jewish communities eventually appeared on every inhabited continent. In medieval Spain, Jews became influential scholars, physicians, and advisors to kings. In Eastern Europe, entire regions developed large Jewish populations speaking Yiddish. In North Africa, Sephardic Jewish communities flourished for centuries. In Ethiopia, an isolated Jewish community called the Beta Israel maintained their faith for over 1,000 years with no contact with other Jews. The prophecy predicted they would be few in number wherever they went, and this proved remarkably accurate. In most countries, Jews never exceeded 2 to 3% of the population, yet they maintained their distinct identity, customs, and faith, despite being minorities everywhere. What makes this particularly striking is the fate of other ancient peoples. Where are the Babylonians today? The Assyrians? The Phoenicians? These once mighty civilizations simply vanished into the mists of history, absorbed by their conquerors or assimilated into other cultures. This was the normal pattern. Conquered peoples lost their identity within a generation or two. But the Jewish people defied this historical norm. Despite facing persecution in virtually every country they inhabited, despite being expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1394, from Spain in 1492, despite pogroms in Eastern Europe and the systematic attempt at complete annihilation during the Holocaust, they maintained their distinct identity for nearly 2,000 years of wandering. The prophecy in Deuteronomy even predicted the psychological state of this diaspora: anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. Any study of Jewish literature during the diaspora reveals exactly this condition: a people living in foreign lands but constantly longing for their homeland, maintaining the prayer "next year in Jerusalem" for nearly 2 millennia. This sets up our next prophecy perfectly, because the same biblical prophets who predicted this unprecedented scattering also made an equally impossible prediction: that these scattered people would somehow maintain their identity and eventually return to their homeland, something that had never happened in all of recorded history. Prophecy number 2: preservation during exile. While predicting the scattering was remarkable enough, the biblical prophets went even further. They predicted that despite this global dispersion, despite facing unprecedented persecution and attempts at annihilation, the Jewish people would miraculously maintain their identity and never be completely destroyed as a nation. This flies in the face of everything we know about ancient history and the fate of conquered peoples. The most audacious prophecy comes from Jeremiah 31:35-37, where God makes this incredible promise. "This is what the Lord says: He who appoints the sun to shine by day, who decrees the moon and stars to shine by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar, the Lord Almighty is his name. Only if these decrees vanish from my sight, declares the Lord, will Israel ever cease being a nation before me. Only if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth below be searched out, will I reject all the descendants of Israel because of all they have done, declares the Lord." Let that sink in for a moment. God is essentially saying that Israel's survival as a nation is as guaranteed as the existence of the sun, moon, and stars. This prophecy was given around 600 BCE, right before Jerusalem's destruction, when every human indicator pointed to Israel's complete annihilation. But Jeremiah wasn't the only prophet to make this seemingly impossible prediction. In Leviticus 26:44, Moses had already declared, "Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord their God." This was written nearly 900 years before the Babylonian exile even began. The prophet Isaiah added even more detail in Isaiah 49:15-16. "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me." The prophecy promised that even if human love could fail, God's commitment to preserving Israel would never waver. Think about how impossible this seemed when these prophecies were written. When Jeremiah spoke these words, the Babylonian army was literally at the gates of Jerusalem. The northern kingdom had already been destroyed by Assyria 136 years earlier, and its 10 tribes had vanished without a trace, completely absorbed into other cultures. Every historical precedent suggested that Judah would meet the same fate, and initially it looked like they would. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar's forces breached Jerusalem's walls, burned the temple, slaughtered thousands, and carried the survivors off to Babylon. For any other ancient people, this would have been the end of their story. The Babylonians, Assyrians, Philistines, and countless other ancient nations simply disappeared into history after such defeats. But something unprecedented began to happen. Instead of assimilating into Babylonian culture, the Jewish exiles did something revolutionary. They created portable Judaism. They developed synagogues as houses of worship that didn't require a temple. They compiled and preserved their scriptures. They maintained their dietary laws, their Sabbath observance, and their distinct identity even in foreign lands. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, many chose to stay in Babylon while still maintaining their Jewish identity. This created the first permanent Jewish diaspora community, Jews living outside Israel while remaining distinctly Jewish. But the real test came with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. This time, there would be no return after 70 years like the Babylonian exile. This time, the scattering would last nearly 2,000 years. Every logical prediction said this would finally be the end of the Jewish people as a distinct group. Instead, something miraculous happened. Throughout nearly 20 centuries of exile, persecution, and systematic attempts at elimination, the Jewish people not only survived, but maintained their unique identity, customs, and faith. They preserved Hebrew as a liturgical language. They maintained their connection to the land of Israel through daily prayers. They passed down their traditions from generation to generation, despite having no central authority, no homeland, and no political power. Consider the historical gauntlet they survived. The Roman persecution that scattered them across the empire. The rise of Christianity and centuries of accusations that they were Christ killers. The Crusades that massacred entire Jewish communities. The Black Death in the 14th century, when Jews were blamed for poisoning wells and entire communities were burned alive. The Spanish Inquisition, which forced conversion or death. Centuries of pogroms in Eastern Europe. And finally, the Holocaust, Hitler's systematic attempt to implement a final solution to what he called the Jewish problem. In 1945, after losing 6 million people, 1/3 of world Jewry, in the most systematic genocide in human history, many observers thought the Jewish people were finally finished as a distinct group. The ancient prophecies seemed to have failed. But just 3 years later, on May 14, 1948, something occurred that had never happened before in recorded human history. A people scattered for nearly 2 millennia across every continent returned to recreate their ancient homeland. The impossibility of this event cannot be overstated. The preservation prophecy wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining identity, culture, and connection to their homeland despite centuries of persecution and forced dispersal. Isaiah 66 verse 8 had predicted this would happen suddenly. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen things like this? Can a country be born in a day or a nation be brought forth in a moment? The mathematical odds of a scattered people maintaining their distinct identity for 2,000 years, surviving systematic attempts at elimination, and then returning to recreate their nation approach zero. Yet the ancient prophets had predicted not just their survival, but their preservation as a distinct people who would one day return to their land. This supernatural preservation during exile sets up our next prophecy, the regathering that was foretold with stunning geographical precision. Prophecy number 3, the return to the land. Now we arrive at what many biblical scholars consider the most spectacular fulfilled prophecy in human history. The prediction that the Jewish people would one day return en masse to the land of Israel. What makes this prophecy absolutely mind-blowing is that it wasn't just predicting a return from the Babylonian exile, but a second, much larger regathering from every corner of the earth. The foundational prophecy comes from Deuteronomy 30 verses 3 to 4, where Moses made this incredible prediction. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. But it gets even more specific. Isaiah 11 verses 11 to 12 provides stunning detail. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Notice the phrase, a second time. Isaiah is clearly distinguishing this future regathering from the return from Babylonian captivity. He's predicting a massive worldwide ingathering that would dwarf the first return under Ezra and Nehemiah. Jeremiah 16 verses 14 to 15 adds another crucial detail. However, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but it will be said, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north and out of all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their ancestors. This prophecy is saying that the second regathering would be so spectacular that it would overshadow even the miracle of the Exodus from Egypt. Think about that claim. The Exodus was the defining moment of Jewish history, celebrated every year at Passover. Yet Jeremiah predicted a future regathering that would be even more remarkable. Ezekiel 36 verse 24 provides the divine promise, "For I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land." The Hebrew word used here for gather is kabatz, which means to collect or assemble from scattered places, exactly describing what would happen in the 19th and 20th centuries. When these prophecies were written, they seemed absolutely impossible. The Jewish people weren't even in exile yet when Moses and Isaiah made these predictions. They were describing a return from a dispersion that hadn't even occurred. It would be like predicting someone will find their lost keys before they've even left the house. The fulfillment began in ways no one expected. In the 1880s, a movement called Zionism emerged, inspired by Jewish thinkers like Theodor Herzl, who argued that Jews needed their own homeland to escape European anti-Semitism. But here's what's remarkable. Many early Zionist leaders weren't even particularly religious. They were motivated by practical concerns, yet they were unknowingly fulfilling ancient prophecies. The first major wave of immigration, called the First Aliyah in the years 1882 to 1903, brought about 35,000 Jews to Ottoman Palestine, primarily from Eastern Europe. The second Aliyah in the years 1904 to 1914 brought another 40,000, including future Israeli leaders like David Ben-Gurion. But the real acceleration came after World War I, when the British Mandate gave international legitimacy to Jewish immigration. The third Aliyah in the years 1919 to 1923 brought 40,000 immigrants, many fleeing post-war pogroms in Eastern Europe. The fourth Aliyah in the years 1924 to 1929 brought 82,000, mainly middle-class families from Poland. Then came the fifth Aliyah in the years 1929 to 1939, driven by the rise of Nazism in Germany. This wave brought 250,000 Jews to Palestine, including many professionals, intellectuals, and artists who would later build Israel's infrastructure and culture. After World War II, the trickle became a flood. The displaced persons camps of Europe were emptied as Holocaust survivors made their way to Palestine. The moment Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, the law of return was passed, guaranteeing every Jew the right to immigrate to Israel. What followed was unprecedented in human history. Operation Magic Carpet, in the years 1949 to 1950, airlifted nearly 49,000 Yemenite Jews to Israel, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy about gathering from the islands of the sea and distant lands. These were Jews who had lived in Yemen for over 1,000 years, yet they maintained their connection to Jerusalem. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah in the years 1951 to 1952 brought 120,000 Iraqi Jews to Israel, ending a Jewish community that had existed in Babylon since the original exile 2,500 years earlier. In a single year, an entire ancient Jewish community packed up and moved to Israel. The prophecy about the gathering from Cush, which refers to Ethiopia, was fulfilled through Operations Moses and Solomon in the years 1984 to 1991, which rescued thousands of Ethiopian Jews who had maintained their Jewish identity in isolation for centuries. Many had never seen modern technology, yet they were brought home to Israel. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened the floodgates for the largest single wave of immigration in Israel's history. Between 1989 and 2006, over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews immigrated to Israel, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy about return from the land of the north. But the geographical precision is astounding. The prophecies mentioned specific regions such as Assyria, which is modern Iraq, Egypt, both Upper and Lower, Cush, which is Ethiopia, Elam, which is Iran, the islands of the Mediterranean, and the four corners of the earth. Jews have returned to Israel from over 120 different countries, ranging from Argentina to Zimbabwe and from India to Iceland. Today, Israel has the largest Jewish population in the world, surpassing even the United States. The ingathering continues as French Jews flee rising anti-Semitism, as the last remnants of ancient Jewish communities in Syria and Yemen are rescued, and as Jews from every continent continue making Aliyah. The second regathering has indeed overshadowed the Exodus in scope and scale. While Moses led perhaps 600,000 Israelites out of Egypt, over 3.5 million Jews have immigrated to Israel since 1948. The prophecy of return from the four corners of the earth has been fulfilled with stunning geographical precision that would be impossible to orchestrate by human planning alone. Prophecy number 4, the restoration of Hebrew language. Now we come to what linguistic experts call the most impossible language resurrection in recorded history. The biblical prophets didn't just predict political and geographical changes for Israel. They predicted something that had never happened before and seemed linguistically impossible: the revival of a completely dead language as the living, breathing tongue of millions of people. The key prophecy comes from Zephaniah 3:9, where God declares, "Then I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder." The Hebrew phrase Safa Berura literally means pure language, or clear speech. Traditional Jewish interpretation has long understood this as referring to the restoration of Hebrew as the language of Israel's return. But there's an even more specific prophecy in Jeremiah 31:23 that directly addresses this linguistic miracle. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says: "When I bring them back from captivity, the people in the land of Judah and in its towns will once again use these words: 'The Lord bless you, O righteous dwelling, O sacred mountain.'" The prophecy specifically mentions that the returnees would speak Hebrew blessings and prayers in their ancestral tongue. Isaiah 19:18 adds another fascinating dimension. "In that day, 5 cities in Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord Almighty." While this verse has multiple interpretations, many scholars see it as predicting the spread of Hebrew beyond Israel's borders, which is exactly what happened as Hebrew became a language of Jewish communities worldwide. To understand how miraculous this prophecy is, we need to grasp what happened to Hebrew historically. During the Second Temple period, Hebrew was already being replaced by Aramaic as the common spoken language. By the time of Jesus, most Jewish people in Palestine spoke Aramaic in daily life, using Hebrew only for religious purposes. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Hebrew's decline accelerated dramatically. The Mishnah, completed around 200 CE, was one of the last major works composed in spoken Hebrew. By 400 CE, Hebrew had essentially ceased to exist as a living conversational language. It survived only as Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, used exclusively for prayer, religious study, and scholarly correspondence. For the next 1,500 years, Hebrew existed in what linguists call clinical death. Unlike Latin, which evolved into Romance languages, or Sanskrit, which continued in scholarly use, Hebrew remained completely static. Jewish communities around the world developed their own languages: Yiddish among Ashkenazi Jews, Ladino among Sephardic Jews, Judeo-Arabic in Middle Eastern communities. But Hebrew remained locked in ancient texts. This created an unprecedented linguistic situation. Here was the original language of an entire people, completely absent from daily life for 15 centuries. Children weren't learning Hebrew as their mother tongue. Mothers weren't singing Hebrew lullabies. Young people weren't courting in Hebrew. The language lacked words for countless modern concepts and technologies that had emerged during its dormancy. When linguists studied dead languages in the 19th century, Hebrew was their prime example of a language that could never be revived. It had been clinically dead too long, lacked native speakers, and had no natural evolution to bridge the gap between ancient and modern usage. The scholarly consensus was that Hebrew revival was linguistically impossible. Then came a single man with an impossible dream. Eliezer ben Yehuda, born Eliezer Yitzhak Perlman in Lithuania in 1858, became obsessed with what seemed like a fantasy, making Hebrew a living language again. In 1881, he and his wife Deborah made a radical decision. They would move to Jerusalem and speak only Hebrew in their home, even though neither was a native Hebrew speaker. Ben Yehuda's first son, Ben Zion, became the first native Hebrew speaker in over 1,500 years. Think about that moment. A toddler babbling his first words in a language that had been silent in homes for 15 centuries. Ben Yehuda had to invent Hebrew words for doll, ice cream, and bicycle because these concepts didn't exist in ancient Hebrew. The resistance was enormous. Orthodox Jews condemned Ben Yehuda's project as sacrilege. Hebrew was too holy for mundane conversation. Secular Jews thought it was impractical. Why revive an ancient language when European languages offered access to modern learning? Turkish authorities imprisoned him for promoting Jewish nationalism. But something extraordinary began happening. As waves of Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine from different countries, Russia, Poland, Germany, Yemen, Morocco, they discovered they had no common language except Hebrew. A Russian Jew couldn't communicate with a Moroccan Jew except through their shared liturgical Hebrew. Hebrew schools began opening. The first Hebrew kindergarten opened in 1898. By 1914, Hebrew was being taught as a living language in dozens of schools across Palestine. Children who learned Hebrew in school taught it to their parents at home, reversing the normal pattern of language transmission. The Hebrew Language Committee, founded by Ben Yehuda in 1890, began the monumental task of creating modern Hebrew vocabulary. They had to invent words for newspaper, train, telephone, democracy, and thousands of other modern concepts. They created new words by extending biblical roots, borrowing from Aramaic, and occasionally adopting terms from European languages. By 1922, when the British Mandate recognized Hebrew as one of Palestine's official languages, it had evolved from a dead liturgical language into a functioning modern tongue. Hebrew newspapers were publishing, Hebrew theatre was thriving, and Hebrew poets were creating new literature. The real miracle occurred after 1948, when Israel's independence created the need for a truly national language. Immigrants arrived speaking dozens of different languages, but their children grew up speaking Hebrew as their native tongue. Within 2 generations, Hebrew had become the primary language of an entire nation. Today, over 9 million people speak Hebrew fluently. Israeli children think in Hebrew, dream in Hebrew, and create modern slang in Hebrew. Hebrew Wikipedia contains over 200,000 articles. Hebrew rap music tops Israeli charts. Hebrew computer programming languages have been developed. The language that was clinically dead for 1,500 years now has more native speakers than Norwegian or Danish. Linguists call this the only successful revival of a completely dead language in human history. No other ancient language, not Latin, not Sanskrit, not ancient Greek, has been successfully resurrected as a native tongue for millions of people. The Hebrew revival defied every rule of historical linguistics and accomplished something that experts considered impossible. The prophecy of pure language restoration has been fulfilled in ways the ancient prophets could hardly have imagined, as Hebrew has become not just a religious language, but the vibrant, evolving tongue of a modern technological society. Prophecy number 5. The blooming of the desert. Multiple biblical prophets predicted that when the Jewish people returned to their land, the desert would bloom like a rose, and the land would become incredibly fertile and productive. Isaiah 35:1 declared, "The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose." Ezekiel 36:8-9 was even more specific. "But you, mountains of Israel, you will produce branches and fruit for my people Israel, for they will soon come home. I am concerned for you and will look on you with favor. You will be plowed and sown." When Mark Twain visited Palestine in 1867, he described it as a desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. The British Survey of Palestine in the 1880s described most of the region as barren wasteland, with malaria-infested swamps and rocky desert covering most of the territory. For nearly 2,000 years, the land had remained largely desolate. Various conquerors, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, Ottomans, had controlled the territory, but none had succeeded in making it significantly productive. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something. Then the Jewish pioneers began returning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They drained the malaria swamps, planted forests, developed new irrigation techniques, and began the seemingly impossible task of making the desert bloom. But the real transformation began after 1948. Israeli agricultural scientists developed revolutionary techniques: drip irrigation, greenhouse technology, water desalination, and computerized farming systems. They learned to grow crops in pure sand, to make fresh water from seawater, and to create fertile soil from desert wasteland. Today's statistics are absolutely mind-blowing. Israel, a country that is 60% desert, has become a major exporter of agricultural products. They've increased their agricultural output by over 1,600% since 1948, while using less water than ever before. Israel now exports over $2 billion worth of agricultural products annually to countries around the world. The transformation is visible from space. Satellite images show Israel as a green oasis surrounded by brown desert. The contrast with neighboring regions is so stark that you can literally see Israel's borders from satellite photographs based on the dramatic difference in vegetation. Israeli innovations in desert agriculture are now being used in Africa, Asia, and South America to help other nations feed their populations. The tiny nation that was supposed to be a barren wasteland has become a world leader in agricultural technology. The ancient prophecy didn't just predict that the desert would bloom. It predicted this would happen specifically when the Jewish people returned. The timing, the scale, and the dramatic visual transformation have all occurred exactly as foretold over 2,500 years ago. The mathematical probability of all these prophecies being fulfilled by chance approaches zero. We're talking about predictions that spanned centuries, involved millions of people, and required the coordination of historical events across multiple continents. Whether you approach these prophecies from a religious perspective or purely from a historical and statistical standpoint, the accuracy and precision are undeniable. These aren't vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways. They're specific, measurable, and historically documented. And here's perhaps the most remarkable part. Many of these prophecies are still unfolding. The biblical prophets predicted not just these historical fulfillments, but future events yet to come. If their track record on fulfilled prophecies is any indication, the story of Israel may have even more remarkable chapters ahead. The next time someone tells you that prophecy is just wishful thinking or lucky guessing, remember what you've learned today. These prophecies represent one of the most extraordinary phenomena in human history: the systematic fulfillment of detailed predictions about the survival, return, and restoration of an ancient people against all odds. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through history, prophecy, and the remarkable story of Israel. Don't forget to like this video if you found it fascinating, subscribe for more content like this, and let me know in the comments which prophecy you found most compelling. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep your mind open to the extraordinary things happening in our world.